You know those ancient, cryptic prophecies that talk about the end of the world? Well, today we're tackling one of the most famous and most debated of them all, from the book of Daniel. We're going to explore a really fascinating interpretation that says the apocalypse it describes, it might not be in our future. It might already be deep in our past. All right, let's dive in. It all kicks off right here with this absolutely chilling prediction. A time of distress so unbelievably severe, it's unlike anything the world has ever seen. For centuries, people have read these exact words and looked to the future, wondering, when is this terrifying moment going to arrive? And that brings us to the million-dollar question for this whole explainer. Is this a prophecy about some future Armageddon? Or, and this is what our source material argues, is it a coded message about a specific cataclysmic event that has already happened? The answer, it turns out, hinges on cracking the rest of the code in Daniel's vision. So let's get into the puzzle itself. We're zeroing in on chapter 12 of Daniel. It's a vision that's just packed with symbols, confusing timelines, and one very, very specific event that acts as the key to the entire prophecy. According to our source, everything, and I mean everything, clicks into place once you figure out what Daniel means when he says that many sleepers in the soil's dust will awaken. If you get this one verse right, the whole Great Tribulation suddenly finds its proper place in history. Okay, so what does this awakening actually mean? It's really not as simple as it sounds. Over the centuries, theologians and scholars have come up with a bunch of different theories. Let's take a quick look at the main ones. Our source text lays out 6 main ideas for what this awakening could be. As you can see, they range from a literal, bodies out of the ground resurrection, to a big spiritual conversion. But the source argues that the first 5 theories kind of fall apart when you look closely at the text. For instance, the prophecy says many will awaken, not all, which throws a wrench in the whole universal resurrection idea. It also says some awaken to life and others to contempt, which makes it hard to argue it's only believers. So after poking holes in those first 5, the source concludes that only one option is left standing, one that fits all the clues. And this is where the whole thing gets really, really interesting. The source basically says, look, if the first 5 theories have these critical flaws, then the 6th one has to hold the answer. And it's a pretty radical idea that reframes the entire prophecy, not around individuals, but around an entire nation. This brings us to the absolute core of the argument. The idea of a national resurrection. The thinking here is that the awakening isn't about bodies coming out of graves at all. It's about the spiritual revival of a whole people. Now, it's absolutely crucial that we get this distinction. We're not talking about zombies or anything like that. A national resurrection uses that really powerful graveyard imagery to describe a moment of huge spiritual and cultural renewal for a nation that had been, for all intents and purposes, asleep or dead. And here it is. This is the key piece of evidence for this whole interpretation. The source points us to the prophet Ezekiel, who uses almost the exact same language. In Ezekiel 37, you have God talking about opening graves, but the text is super clear that this is a metaphor for bringing the nation of Israel back from captivity. The argument is, Daniel is just using the same well-established metaphor. So when did this national resurrection happen? Well, the source pinpoints the ministry of Jesus, his work, healing people, restoring the law, challenging the corrupt system, is seen as the very moment Israel was awakened. But, just like the prophecy said, some people embraced this new life, while others completely rejected it, awakening only to judgment. Okay, hold on. If the awakening happened way back in the 1st century, that has massive implications for the time of distress. It means we should be looking for that huge catastrophe in the exact same time period. And this just brilliantly illustrates the connection. Just look at the language here. On the left, you've got Daniel's prophecy. On the right, Jesus' own words from the Gospel of Matthew. The phrasing is practically identical. The source argues this is no accident. Jesus is directly quoting Daniel's prophecy and telling everyone when it's about to go down. And he gives a very specific timeline. In Matthew 24, Jesus says flat out that all these things, including the Great Tribulation, will happen to this generation. Our source is firm that this phrase always, always means the people listening to him right then, not some far-off future group. This puts the Great Tribulation squarely in the first century, ending with the brutal, historic destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. Okay, but what about those really strange numbers at the end of the chapter? The 1290 and 1335 days. If this isn't about a future apocalypse, what in the world do they mean? Let's check out the source's interpretation. First up, we've got this number, 1290 days. If you take it literally, it's about 3.5 years, and that has caused endless speculation. But what if it's not meant to be literal at all? Instead of a literal countdown, the source proposes we look at this symbolically. The idea is that the 1290 days aren't one continuous block of time, but represent 3 different periods of suffering, each symbolized by the number 430. As you can see in the table, these line up with historical eras of oppression. The final 45 days, which get you to that blessed number of 1335, are argued to be the Great Tribulation itself, that final intense struggle leading right up to AD 70. But why the number 430? What's so special about that? Well, this is the core of the symbol. In the Old Testament, 430 is the number of years the Israelites were in captivity in Egypt. So by using this number, the prophecy is basically framing Jerusalem's suffering under corrupt leaders as a new spiritual Egypt, a brand new bondage that God's people needed a new exodus from. So, okay, let's recap. We've decoded the awakening, we've pinpointed the tribulation, and we've cracked the timeline. What does it all add up to? Why does reading this ancient prophecy as ancient history even matter today? Here's the entire story in 4 simple steps. First, you get the spiritual awakening during Jesus' ministry. Second, the time of distress begins as the early church faces terrible persecution. Third, the climax, the war and the total destruction of Jerusalem. And finally, fourth, the deliverance of the faithful followers, the new people of God, from that judgment. It creates this complete, self-contained story that was fulfilled entirely in the first century. Ultimately, the source suggests that the message for us today is the same one Daniel received way back then. At the end of his vision, he's told he can rest. Even though he was completely torn up by the suffering he foresaw, he could find peace knowing God's victory was certain. The takeaway is that we can find that same peace, knowing that even in our own trials, the outcome is secure. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. This has been an explainer of one very specific, and for a lot of people, very controversial interpretation. But it opens up a much bigger question. If ancient prophecies can be deeply tied to the history of their own time and their near future instead of our distant future, how does that change the way we read and understand these powerful and influential texts today?